Yesterday we began to read the book of the prophet Jonah. And we saw yesterday how Jonah received a calling from the Lord, but tried his best to run away from that calling and to ignore that calling. He was being called to go to the east where Nineveh was found, and he went on a boat that took him as far west towards Spain as he could manage. Jonah thought that running away from God would bring an end to all of his problems. He thought that maybe if he ran away from God, it would be like going to the Caribbean. But he found out that when you run away from God, you end up in the belly of the whale. So the first lesson that I think it's important for us to remember is that either if you choose to hear God's calling or if you choose to run away from it, in either scenario, there's going to be some suffering. But for sure, there's always more suffering when you run away than when you go for that calling. So after Jonah spent a fair deal of time inside of the belly's whale, it's interesting to see when he goes out into the shore, guess what? God is still calling him. The call of God remains stable and remains present even though we turn our back on the Lord. And this makes me think about a beautiful story on the life of St. John Paul II. Maybe you heard about this story, but I think it's good to remember it again. There was a priest who, unfortunately, he left his ministry and his life took a really bad path. And perhaps he chose the path of sin, this ordained priest, and he ended up like a beggar. He had no job, no stability, no money. And a friend of this priest, the one who ended up as a beggar, told Pope John Paul II about this priest. And maybe he wanted to introduce him to St. John Paul, so maybe something could work out. So they managed this interview, and the priest brought his friend, the beggar priest. I suppose that the beggar, at least, he got a little bit more, tidy for that meeting. And as soon as John Paul II saw him, he said, "Please, hear me in confession." John Paul II asked this beggar, who was a priest, to ask him in confession. And the priest, who was a beggar, he tried to make up an excuse. And he said, I've been so many years away from the ministry, I'm not ready. And you know what St. John Paul II told him? He said, "Once a priest, always a priest." And it's the same with Jonah. He ran away, he was in the whale, he came back to the shore. Guess what? God told me, I'm still calling you. The calling is still here. Go to Nineveh. And the last thing I want to comment is, Jonah's ministry was a fruitful ministry. If you see the life of the other prophets, if you think about Isaiah, Jeremiah, one of the constant notes is that they're prophets who don't succeed as much as they would have liked. Many times they're persecuted, many times they're hurt. But Jonah, he was hurt. Why? This is not an absolute answer, but maybe. You know why? Because he was humble. He was humbled before. He slipped. He missed the mark. He ran away, but because he was able to get up again, he had a fruitful ministry. I'm not saying that the other prophets were not humble. I'm just saying there's a beautiful message here, and the message is, even though sometimes you slipped, even though sometimes you and me, we made mistakes, still our ministry can be fruitful. In the same way that Jonah's preaching was fruitful. So let us remind ourselves, either if you choose to hear the calling or to run away, there's going to be some suffering. But the worst suffering comes when you run away. Second lesson, even when we change and when we want to run away, God always remains stable in His calling. Think about the story of John Paul II. And the third lesson is, even when we have slipped, even then, God wants to make with us a fruitful ministry and preaching.